We are very lucky to have a distinguished guest with us today. Brenda Wineapple is a nonfiction writer, literary critic, and essayist. Ms. Wineapple's work has received very high praise. Her most recent book, Ecstatic Nation, was called Magnificent in the Washington Post and named a notable book by the New York Times. And White Heat was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. If that weren't enough for you, she's also a recipient of the Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Pushcart Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, among many others. She's here with us tonight to talk about her new book, The Impeachers, The Trial of Andrew Johnson and the Dream of a Just Nation. Called Absorbing and Important by Pulitzer Prize winner John Meacham, The Impeachers is an extensively researched and engrossing account of the first impeachment of an American president. I don't want to spoil anything for you, but let me just say that it's a very timely book. On that note, please help me give a warm welcome to Brenda Wineapple.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. My day began today with the announcement that Robert Mueller was going to speak at the Justice Department, and I thought that was going to upstage me. Actually, it didn't. And now, at the end of my day, a tornado is coming. So, so I don't know what that means exactly, but here we all are, and thank you very much for coming. It's my pleasure to be back in Washington at this wonderful bookstore, Politics and Prose, and especially to talk about what Ari said is evidently a timely book. I should mention, however, that the interesting part of this timeliness for me is that I began this book 6 years ago. Who knew? I couldn't have, in my wildest imagination, if I wrote fiction, I still couldn't have dreamed the times we have now. And certainly I had no idea that, as I said, this would be timely or anything would. And what I remember actually was when I was starting to work on this book, and it was a little distressing, as I might say, people who associated me with some of the work that I've done on literary subjects, some of you may know this, would ask me what I was working on, and I would say I was working on a book about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and they'd say, and they would head for the door. There was nothing more to say. The other comment that I would sometimes get was, Andrew Jackson? I didn't know he'd been impeached, because people mistook Andrew Johnson and Andrew Jackson, and there's actually some similarities, but quite a difference between them. So that didn't work out so well either. And so one of the things that got me involved in the book, and I suppose distressed numbers of people when they wanted me working on literary subjects, one of the reasons that I got involved in the book in the first place, I usually begin a book with a question. And the particular question that I had about this impeachment was a simple one, really. In working on Ecstatic Nation, as Ari mentioned, the previous book to this one, it occurred to me, since that book really covered a wide swath of time, before, during, and after the Civil War. A little ambitious, but in any event, it occurred to me as I was working on that I, who am fairly, well educated and literate somewhat, I didn't know anything about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And that struck me as odd, because it seemed to me that this was an unusual and potentially gripping event in American history, a major event in American history. And it was curious that I didn't know anything about it. And when I told people, as I said, if they didn't vote for the door, they thought, or they didn't think that that I was talking about Andrew Jackson, they had a kind of assumption about this impeachment, which was, it was a terrible mistake. It should never have happened. It's embarrassing. Let's move on. And that was, in a sense, pretty much all anyone knew. And it seemed odd to me that was the vantage point. And in fact, I noticed, and this was late, actually I was almost, or if not finished with the book, I think it was finished with the book. I turned it in, I think it was last year. There was a front page, I think it was last year, there was a front page review in the New York Times about a book on impeachment, generally speaking, because there was a lot of discussion about it in the culture. And the reviewer on that front page review mentioned briefly the Johnson impeachment and said that it was preposterous. And I thought, that's so interesting. That was, that was 2018, that was still the view of it. So there are two things, why did it disappear, and why did it, was it regarded, if it was regarded at all, as preposterous? And those were the questions that I began with. And I particularly began with those questions because it occurred to me, writing Ecstatic Nation, how preposterous an event could it have been? It must have been. Imagine. Think back to the period of time in which it happened. That was the first thing that I did. And I knew something about the period of time. And I thought, well, this impeachment of Johnson happened in 1868. That doesn't necessarily mean anything to anybody. But 3 years before, just 3 years before, first of all, a terrific, and I don't mean terrific in a positive sense, horrific, all right? A horrific civil war had just been fought in this country, where at least 750,000 people had been killed. And I think that's a low estimate, because it doesn't count, all the people who died of starvation in the cities and who weren't even on census rolls. So that's huge. A huge number of people had been slaughtered in a war that was not fought on foreign soil, but was fought here. And the war itself, in April 1865, was barely over. In some parts of the country, like Texas, it really wasn't over. The war was barely over. Right? There was a peace agreement at Appomattox signed by Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. And in that particular, just days practically after that, the President Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated here in Washington. It was the first ever presidential assassination. So here you have a horrific war being fought in this country about the nature of this country. That's number one. Number two, you have a president dead, right, killed by an assassin's bullet, mainly because of that war. Never had happened before. Three, then, just 3 years later, 3 very small years later, you can't even get out of high school in those years. 3 years later, you have the impeachment, the first ever presidential impeachment. I thought, that's remarkable, isn't it? Isn't that the most amazing thing? Why would you put yourself through that if you didn't have to for some reason? There must be more to the story. So you begin really, in a sense, with a hunch. And my hunch was there has to be more to the story. But I do want to add that I really didn't know what the answer was. I had no idea why that story was basically disregarded. And the context in which that impeachment had occurred never really was talked about. The most I had heard, I remember this, remember it too well from high school, speaking of, I remember that I was told, and probably had to study for the test, that the impeachment, insofar as I was told anything, was the brainchild of a group of maniacal crackpots, right, who wanted to bring this good, loyal president down, namely Andrew Johnson. And so, you go to high school and you look at the maps and you do what you're supposed to do. And things don't set right for many, many years. And that's what I was told. And in fact, what occurred to me was that point of view came right out of, in a sense, believe this or not, it came right out of the movie Birth of a Nation. 1915. Some of you may be familiar with that. And if you're not familiar with the movie, you just go right home and rent it, because it's in for a real treat. And in that particular movie, it's the same kind of view, because there's a particularly onerous character in that movie. I don't know who was played by him, but who plays him. But he's supposed to be depicting the representative from Pennsylvania, Thaddeus Stevens, and he is a diabolical figure who is just out to ruin the Union after the Civil War. And in a sense, that figure remained extant throughout history, it seemed to me, for another at least 50 years, because in 1957, there was a very well-known at the time, and you may be familiar with this too, well-known book called Profiles in Courage. You may have heard of it. It was written by a man named Ted Sorensen, who is the writer behind JFK. It was published by John Kennedy. And in that book, you may know, and if you don't, I'm going to tell you, that in that book, one of the profiles in courage is a man named Edmund Ross. And if the name doesn't roll off the tongue, you may recall that Edmund Ross was the junior senator from Kansas who cast the deciding one vote to acquit Andrew Johnson in the Senate when he was tried for impeachment. And so what Kennedy, Sorensen, whoever it was writing that particular book was saying, look what this wonderful Edmund Ross did. He went against his party, the Republicans. He stood up. He's courageous. And he voted to maintain the presidency and the president. 1957. It's a while ago, but still you see how this notion kind of persists. And there's a great line from that book that I really must read to you, because in that particular book, Kennedy or whoever wrote this, he said, the actual cause for which the president, Johnson, was impeached and then tried was not fundamental to the nation. Okay, but since I disbelieve everything anyway, I was born a skeptic, I certainly don't believe that because of just logic. Just starting with logic. It didn't seem logical to me that it wasn't fundamental to the nation in 1868, only 3 years after a civil war, when this country is still trying to heal itself and has barely kind of gotten the wheels onto Reconstruction, which I'd also heard was a disaster, but that's another story. Because in a sense, really what we do in history, we go from one big president, Lincoln, to Grant, and we never think about that 3-year period. So that's where I began the book 6 years ago. And as I said, I had no sense of the present moment whatsoever. But I was sort of interested, as I'm saying, I was interested in the past and what exactly, had happened and what was going on. Now, let me just sketch a little bit more of the conditions the conditions around that impeachment before we get into some of the perhaps motivators, if you will, of it. The conditions are, it's the end of the war, as I said. So what do you do now? Okay, the war is over. Okay, so what does that mean? The country was broken apart. And as you recall, you don't literally recall, but as you know, the South seceded, 11 southern states seceded. Now the war is over. So what do you do with them, right? What do you say? Oh, come on back. Take your seat in Congress. It was a mistake. We know you didn't mean it. All those people dead, especially in the South because a war was fought in the South. It's okay. Welcome back. All is forgiven. Do you do that? Well, it seems a little odd to do that in that particular sense for several reasons, never mind the moral or ethical reasons. One of the reasons is, as you know, in the Constitution, before the Civil War, the Constitution defined enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, which means, right, after Emancipation Proclamation and then coming the 13th Amendment, and there's no more slavery, that basically what you have now are formerly enslaved people counting as whole people, which they were anyway, but now they're counted that way in terms of representation. If you suddenly start counting, the population of the South has increased enormously, and if you say, come on back, right, then you have more people being represented in the House at that particular time, which means, strangely enough, you're restoring power to the South. And in particular, what you're restoring power to is the white South, because those formerly enslaved people do not have a vote. In fact, they do not even have civil rights. They are not even counted yet as citizens. So this is, you see the context and you see the problems already. And I didn't even start to talk about those 4 million people who, by the way, were denied the ability to marry. They weren't allowed to learn to read and write. They obviously couldn't travel. They didn't have wages, and in fact, didn't really own the clothes on their back. So suddenly you've got a huge number in the population that has nothing, that needs education, that needs work, that needs some place to go. So you've got that, plus you've got this question about representation. That's the predicament, if you will, that both Congress and the presidency inherit in 1865, right? So you see there's a problem. So to say that this has nothing to do with the nation, I don't think so, because right there is an issue. So what happened? Johnson takes the oath of office just hours after Lincoln is pronounced dead. And this particular ceremony goes much better than his earlier ceremony when he takes the oath of the vice presidential office, because at that particular time he had, I guess he took a few medicinal swigs of whiskey in his room before he hit the stage, or it was certainly before he hit the Bible, because he planted a big slobbery kiss on the Bible. And he went on incoherently to such an extent that when they were walking outside, Lincoln said to somebody around him, keep Johnson away from me, and even members of the cabinet were so kind of struck by Johnson's behavior that they said, is he crazy? So that's how we started the vice presidential inauguration. But just a few months later, when he is inaugurated as president, he says he's going to keep the cabinet. It's going to be an easy transition from one presidency to another. Everybody, as you might expect, was very hopeful, because everybody wanted to be hopeful, and there was no reason not to be, because Johnson had, during the war, said over and over again that secession and treason is a crime, and treason must be punished. So he was, after all, Lincoln's vice president. So why wouldn't you be hopeful? And moreover, if you knew anything at that particular time about Andrew Johnson, and you may not know too much, but what you would know is this, that he was the only Southern senator, the only senator from the South, he represented Tennessee, who stood up during what was called the secession winter of 1860-1861, after Lincoln was elected, when the South started talking about secession, particularly South Carolina. He was the only one who stood up, and he said, I am for the Union. I am for the Constitution. We have to preserve the Constitution and the Union. I am against secession. He was called a traitor in the South when he went back to Tennessee. He was hung in effigy from one end of the state to the other. When he left Tennessee to come back to Washington, he had to avoid assassins' bullets. So he, in fact, was considered in the North a hero. And he was put on Lincoln's ticket, probably by Lincoln, because he was that hero, and he represented the South, and he was a Democrat, which is also another nice way of balancing. We don't do that anymore, right? But of balancing the ticket, because Lincoln's a Republican, so he's taking a Southern Democrat on the ticket because he wanted to win. What Lincoln wanted to do very much was to win and finish the war. What he didn't want to do, of course, and nobody does, is die, and he didn't think he was going to. And the rest is sort of history, because we don't seem to know it. But in any event, so Johnson is considered by those in the Republican Party and even in his former party, the Democrats, to be a hopeful sign that suddenly the country can be knit back together in some kind of fashion that is equitable and that represents justice and that would not squander the values for which the war was fought. Okay? So what happens? This is April. Congress is not in session. It's in recess. It doesn't meet again until December. So naturally, there are some eminent congressmen actually. Not that they weren't people, but there were no women. Well, maybe some weren't, but in any event, they go and they call on Johnson, as many did at this particular time. But in this case, the congressional delegation that went to see him said, I think you should call a special session of Congress to deal with these issues, because it's up to Congress to determine the qualifications for its own membership, right? So it's really, this falls under congressional purview in that particular sense. So Johnson says, no, I don't think so, or words to that effect. It was probably a little bit more vulgar than that. He probably listened very carefully and then did what exactly he wanted to, which was to restore the South as it was, in the simplest sense. I'm not going to get into all the details, but basically what he was doing was, by executive proclamation, he was restoring the states of the South, because he said, which is rather charming in a way, he said that secession had never happened because it was illegal. And of course, well, yeah, I know you get it, because Thaddeus Stevens pointed out, which needed pointing out, that's like saying murder can never happen because it's illegal. I mean, the logic was sort of lost on Johnson. But in any event, he said, secession didn't happen. We have to bring back our erring sisters. He's using Lincoln's language in that particular sense, although Lincoln went in a different direction. And Congress, needless to say, members of Congress, particularly people like, as I mentioned, Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, they're beginning to get a little bit nervous. A little bit nervous is an understatement, but they still they have hope. They want to believe that these situations can be rectified. The point is that they really cannot be rectified. And the situation really, in that particular sense, goes from bad to worse, in that when Congress does come back into session and begins passing such legislation as civil rights legislation, which really is pretty mild stuff. It's not very radical at all. Civil rights legislation basically confers citizenship on every member of the United States, right? And in that case, guarantees due process, right? And that's it. Doesn't even talk about voting rights. Johnson, although many people thought they had his blessing to do this, Johnson vetoes it. He vetoes that. He vetoes funding for what was called the Freedmen's Bureau, which is supposed to deal with refugees and former slaves, education, work, contracts, all the kinds of things people need. He vetoes all of this legislation, and Congress passes the legislation over his vetoes, but even more than that, Johnson goes out and Johnson was a man, as I said. He's from Tennessee. He was representing Tennessee. He was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he didn't have an easy time of it. He was born in a log cabin like Lincoln, but unlike Lincoln, he went in a slightly different direction, and he was bound out. He was sent out in his youth as an indentured servant. And if you know anything about indentured servitude, it's bad. It really is. And your life is not your own until you're 21. And in fact, it was so horrific for him and his brother, he ran away, and there was a bounty put on his head. And a bounty put on his head is almost, it's not the same by any means, but almost as if he's a fugitive slave. And in that sense, as a white person, he was above, in the social hierarchy, particularly of the South, he was above the slaves, but not by much in this particular sense, and in his own mind, certainly. So one of the ways that, in a sense, he changed classes, because he was not educated, he was not schooled, he really had nothing. He became a tailor. That's what he was indentured as, in a tailor shop. He did very well. He ran for mayor, he ran for alderman. And in a certain sense, in politics, particularly then, politics was a way of changing classes. And he was able to, in some sense, quote unquote, better himself. He could change classes in that way. And one of the things that I find grimly amusing is that one of the things that Johnson did when he was rich enough and powerful enough is to show that he had made it in Southern society was that he bought himself a few slaves. So that tells you a little bit about Andrew Johnson. So there's a lot of class issues that are going on here. So back to Washington in 1866, Johnson, who had been a notorious stump speaker, loved to take his speeches or his rallies or his pleas or his platforms to what he called the people. He said that he was speaking for the people, directly to the people, and he was called in his own time a demagogue. So not only was he vetoing such things as civil rights legislation, but he was going around, people thought he must be drunk, but the sad thing is that he wasn't drunk, haranguing people. And particularly he would start haranguing members of Congress like Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner or people outside of Congress who were pushing against him in trying to get the country to turn actually in a different direction. And he would say things like, they should be executed. Ever hear that before? You know, they should be hanged, which is kind of like lock her up, but in a different, sense. And people were horrified by this language. And he wasn't drinking. He was quite serious about this. So the combination of usurping the functions of the legislature, of squandering the victories, if you will, the northern victories during the war, depriving an entire population of civil rights and citizenship, or trying to. And then in the summer of 1866, going out and, in this particular context, denouncing the 14th Amendment, because Congress, in its wisdom, had realized you can get civil rights legislation through, but we have to enshrine it in an amendment. So we're going to put together the 14th Amendment, now needs to be ratified by the states. Johnson goes out on a speaking tour that was of very large proportions. It was covered all of the time in all of the newspapers. It was called The Swing Around the Circle. And he would harangue against the 14th Amendment, against black people, against members of Congress, to such an extent that Ulysses S. Grant, who was dragooned into this speaking tour, was so mortified that he went on a bender and got himself locked up in a baggage car so that nobody would see that he was roaring drunk for part of the trip, and then he got sent home. That's how bad things were. Congress, meantime, did not really want to impeach Andrew Johnson. They had been trying everything, and they continued to try everything, even though there were members of Congress. In Congress, the Republicans in Congress were themselves divided into basically three parts: conservative, moderate, and radical. Radical is like progressive today. And one sort of outlier, progressive, called for impeachment early on in 1867 because there was enough already, basically. And so what the House decided to do is bury the impeachment in the Judiciary Committee and undertake an investigation that went on and on and on for a while. And meantime, while this was happening, and it did change its mind later on and voted again, but then the whole House didn't vote. So they're taking their time with this, and it's not an easy thing to do, to impeach a president. And it's not the first thing you want to do. And so what Congress did was pass several Reconstruction laws. And one of the Reconstruction laws was actually to enfranchise the black population of the South and to make sure that people were able to get to the polls, both blacks and whites, to be able to get safely to the polls. And the way they would get safely to the polls and be protected was through the military. So the South was divided into military districts with a general put in charge, And in charge of those generals was Grant, and in charge of Grant was Stanton, Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War. He's still in Johnson's cabinet. Johnson hated him. So Congress, in its infinite wisdom, decided to pass what's called the Tenure of Office Act. You may have heard of that, probably not, and if you have, you know it's dubious constitutionally. And what it was supposed to do in this particular context was protect Edwin Stanton's job so that Johnson couldn't fire him, because Stanton was protecting the military who was protecting the people of the South who wanted to get to the polls. Very simple in that way. It was the act, the Tenure of Office Act was of dubious constitutionality. It was years later repealed. Even Stanton himself, when he first heard about it, said, the constitutionality is not great, but, he wasn't in Congress, nothing he could do. They passed it to protect him. Long story, even shorter. What does Johnson do? He fires Stanton anyway, because the law stipulated that anyone, a civil servant like a cabinet member, who was confirmed by the Senate couldn't be fired unless that firing was also confirmed by the Senate. And the Senate didn't confirm Stanton's firing, as you might guess. At that point, all bets were off. At that point, the House votes to impeach the sitting president. Never before, and this had been 3 years of agony for the country, not the impeachment. The impeachment itself, I don't think, was agony for the country. It was the 3 years leading up to it was agonizing. And the interesting thing to me about the impeachment is that it's located really at a crossroads, I think, in American history. Because at that particular crossroads, after the Civil War, the country could have gone in a different direction than the one it went in. And that gets to me to the question, the burning question of why we didn't, or why I shouldn't say, I don't want to speak for you, but why I didn't know about this particular impeachment, why it seemed suppressed, why it was dismissed in profiles and courage and all of that. And when I began to really sort of dig into it, and I looked at what the various people in Congress were saying during the impeachment debates and then during the trial, what I realized, and I think Charles Sumner put it best, he said, this, meaning the impeachment, is one of the last great battles with slavery, because the impeachment of Andrew Johnson was undertaken to eradicate the noxious and lingering effects of slavery. Sure, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but what does that mean if you're going to allow Southern legislatures to pass what are basically called black codes, which deny black people, the ability to serve on juries, to speak in their own defense, to make contracts, to travel freely, even to marry. I mean, that is really a form of slavery by another name. So this was one of the last great battles with slavery. And according to Stevens, if we don't undertake this act now, impeachment, that we will be living with the noxious effects of racial conflict for the rest of our history. What was interesting to me in working on this book was the fact that there were numbers of people who were, to my mind, not crackpots, not maniacs, but actually visionary. And what they could do is they could envision the country 10, 20, 100 years hence. And what they really wanted to do, to me, was to really create a fairer and freer and more just, more perfect union. And they really felt that someone like Andrew Johnson was an impediment, not just an impediment, a hindrance, but a tremendous obstacle that really needed to be not just overcome, but in some sense to have him turn around and say that he could not be a king. he could not undertake reconstruction of the country, but he said that he actually said this, we don't need reconstruction because the secession didn't happen. I guess the war didn't happen either. And so that in that particular sense, what they were saying, look, is all actions have consequences and we need to deal with the consequences of this particular person's actions. And that's why we undertook the first ever impeachment, which itself, I haven't even talked to you about that. I've just given you the kind of context for which it happened. But in that particular sense, I'm going to stop here. And I think that this sort of said enough and give you a taste of what I think the book really is about and what this impeachment is about. And that is really in that particular context. And I think also why we don't know about it, because it was fundamentally about race. But at that juncture, or this juncture, I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Hi. Could you go into...
Popped right up.
Okay. Benjamin Wade
Yeah.
and how that the interaction and why people voted in different ways.
Yeah, well, the complicated... When the trial actually went to the Senate, all right, because as you know, the Constitution doesn't tell us too much, but what it does say, beyond the conditions for impeachment, which is itself complicated and interesting, that the Senate shall try the impeached president. And in that particular juncture, as you know, there were 7 people who were called recusants that voted against the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And, well, they voted to acquit him in that sense. And one of the reasons, among many, and I do want to make a note to make sure that I say one of them, but one of the reasons was that in the wings, waiting to be president, if Johnson were taken out of office, was a man named Benjamin Wade, who was considered a radical Republican. As I said, I don't like those terms because they've been used as negative terms, but that's what he was considered. And in fact, he was considered so radical because he was in favor of things like women voting and had been for a long time. And in fact, some of the opposition press were saying if Wade gets into the White House, he's going to put Susan B. Anthony in the cabinet. So it's pretty scary stuff. So the idea of having Wade in the White House, even for a short period of time, because the impeachment trial went through March, April, and finally May, and as you know, there is an election coming in November, even for that short amount of time, terrified a number of the moderate and conservative Republicans. And moreover, Grant was waiting in the wings to run too, and no one wanted Grant to be saddled with Wade because they were afraid that then Grant would have to take Wade as his vice president. And besides that, they thought Wade was an old man. He was 67. So there's a little bit of that involved too. So that was one of the reasons. Wade was a reason those 7 recusants voted. There were very good arguments made in the Senate. I have to give, the defense attorneys all due credit because they were really quite brilliant, it seems to me, in the way they argued the case. But it was also another reason that they voted the way they did, Wade notwithstanding, was because there was a little money passing back and forth, evidently. But we have another question. I'll go over to this side, then this side. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's about the line of succession. After the president, the vice president became the president. So isn't it the line of succession? House Speaker comes in to fill in. When was this changed?
It was Wade. He was the Senate president pro tempore, so he was next in line.
So he's not the speaker. Is it?
No, the speaker was a man named Schuyler Colfax.
But
he became the vice president with Grant, so he was okay, and he was a radical too. But the line of succession was.
And then one more comment: Isn't
Sure.
that the American exceptionalism that prevented that led to a lot of hesitancy to impeach a president? That to show to the Europe that the presidents are not like a corrupted royalty in Europe. So it's a way to That isn't one of the reasons for the hesitancy to impeach him?
No, I don't think so. I think that in this particular, I mean, Benjamin Franklin has this great line where he says, impeachment is the sort of democratic equivalent of regicide, basically. But he was quipping in a sense. Impeachment is a very logical process, and it's a slow process. One of the reviews that was interesting for my book was nice in the sense they said that I show that the process for people who went and it was the hottest ticket in town. You couldn't get a ticket to go and sit during the impeachment hearings. It was a really exciting kind of thing. But once you got there, if you were looking for thunder and lightning and all kinds of things to happen, it was kind of boring because there were a lot of lawyers sitting around talking. And, they were at one point, I think I said something like they're arguing about how many, angels are on the head of a pin, and there's no even pin there, in that sense. So it's a very kind of deliberating process. So I think also to your question, and I'll get to the other person's question, but I think also, I got to say, at this particular time, as far as I could see, and maybe somebody else would see it differently, the United States and people in Congress and in the country, they weren't looking to Europe. They weren't sort of thinking, oh, how do we flex our muscle, or are we exceptional? They were thinking, we just had a war. What are we going to do now? How are we going to reintegrate the country along lines that are going to make the country better? How are we going to do that? Now, Thaddeus Stevens was saying, he was coming really at a real extreme case, because he was saying, what you should do? You take those plantations and all those people who've been working on those plantations, you divide it up and you give it to those people who've been working on those plantations, and that'll destroy the Southern hierarchy aristocracy. So they weren't looking to England or to France. England and France had their own problems in any event. They're looking to figure out what they're going to do in this particular country at this time. So I don't think, that's my view in any event. I didn't see any evidence of that, but it's interesting. Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're
certainly
very
one of the folks who knew essentially nothing about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson.
You're not alone. But now now you have to buy the book.
Many of the things you said make Andrew Johnson seem like he was pretty widely unpopular. So my question is, did he have anything resembling a political base? And was that political base a sort of just Southern whites, or Southern whoever? And if so, was there a change in his political base from the time that he stood up and against secession prior to?
Well, there had to be.
To after the Civil War.
Yeah.
When what was his political base like, and were there kind of changes in it?
Well, he lost a lot of Southern support, because a lot of the Southerners, in 1860, 61, and 62 were basically saying,
he's a traitor.
You're a traitor, and you're pandering to the North in that particular sense, right? In that way. And then when he comes into power, and what I mean by power is the presidency, really, and he starts pardoning. I don't think I mentioned that. That was another of his egregious acts. He was pardoning about 100 people, 100 former Confederates that would wind up in the police force and in the state legislatures. He was pardoning them about 100 a day. By the time he was out of office, it was about 7,000 at least of them. So he was trying to make the so-called planters his so-called base, but there was no way that was ever going to happen, because they considered him what was called a scrub. And what was meant by that was, another term they used was poor white trash. And there was no way that he was ever going to not be poor. He could be powerful poor white trash, but he was still poor white trash. That's number one. Number two, the interesting thing is that by 68, right, obviously the Republicans didn't want to touch him. Whether you were conservative, moderate, or more radical, nobody wanted to touch him. He was poison, and even the ones who were conservative couldn't bear him. Even the ones who defended him couldn't bear him. But the Democrats didn't want to put him on the ticket in 1868. He wanted to. He couldn't understand it. He said, I've done everything they wanted me to do. Why don't they want me? But he was toxic for everyone. It doesn't mean he didn't have a base, in the sense that when he would go out on his speaking tours, that there were always people there that, there were some hecklers, but there were people there who were egging him on. He wouldn't go to the lengths that he went to if there weren't people there egging him on. But nobody wanted to touch him.
I'm looking for
I know what you're looking for.
contemporary parallels, and it doesn't sound like the parallels.
I can't provide it in terms of that exactly. No. But yes, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could expand on the money changing hands during the Senate trial. I mean, who was making the payoff? Were they trying to protect Johnson, or were they trying to protect the policies you were putting into place?
They weren't protecting the policies so much, which is interesting. It's an interesting question. They were really trying to protect Johnson because they were trying to protect themselves. In other words, for one example is, as I mentioned before, there were numbers of people, particularly sort of down the middle Republicans, who very much wanted to make sure Grant had no problems getting into office. And they didn't really want to rock too many votes in that particular sense. So there were also people who were who really, I don't know what they really believed, but they really, they were Democrats. They were Johnson. They didn't want him to run again. They thought he was poison, but they didn't want to be tarred with the brush of impeachment. So they wanted very much to keep Wade out of office because of his monetary policies, for example. Never mind women, but in any event. So there were a lot of mixed motives. So that the money, it's not clear where the slush funds came from. My best guess, and I couldn't, if I could have found it, believe me, I would have. But most of the evidence actually probably disappeared early on, although I know some people had it in the 1860s and 70s, but it's gone now. My best guess is that William Seward, who is himself a real cagey operator, and he'd been very cagey with the 13th Amendment for Lincoln, sort of greasing a lot of palms. He was greasing a lot of palms at that particular time. There was a lot of money, and there was a lot of Midwestern money that was coming in, too, from the Democrats. So there was a lot of money, but there was, as I say in the book, there was a lot of smoke but no fire. In other words, they could never really there was an investigation after the acquittal to try to figure out who was bribed, and that was going to disappear. But it was clearly dark money going. Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
I'm just going to pop in really quick to say we have time for 2 more questions. So I think we have 2 more people in line.
Okay.
Okay. To your question about why people didn't know what this process had been, I kind of knew about it, and I'm wondering, why did I know?
Yeah, why did you know?
And I'm thinking it was John Hope Franklin.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, did his work inform your effort?
To a certain extent, but I was interested because John Hope Franklin, and there were a number of sort of, I don't know if you call them revisionists who reconsidered Reconstruction, which is what he did. And they actually came out of W.E.B. Du Bois, who also knew about it. But when you think about the major literature of the time, even this guy Eric McKittrick, I'm thinking of him because he was one of those people, although he was white, who's writing in this particular period. When it gets to the impeachment, they don't say very much.
No, but more on the Reconstruction.
They talk about the Reconstruction, rolling back Reconstruction. Yeah. But I've never seen anybody. I mean, they basically kind of slide over it because there's so much other stuff to get to. And it gets so bad so quickly in some ways. But at that particular point, they're interested, rightly so, in all the black men in the South who get into the legislative offices. And that was great. And that was because of this Congress, not this Congress, but that Congress, that Congress that took pains to get to in a sense, defang Andrew Johnson. But they don't really look at the impeachment.
And Frederick Douglass as well talked about Johnson.
Yeah, but Frederick Douglass again.
He died.
Well, also, I mean, he gets Johnson's number, and he goes in 1866 with a delegation who says, "Hey, listen, if black men can go to battle, they should be. If you can get bullets, you might as well have ballots, And Johnson basically said, come again. And then he says to his secretary, "Those sons of bitches are out to get me." It's
Actually, he used the end.
I know, but he said two things. I'm only quoting one of them. Yeah, no, it's some terrible stuff. But you're in the minority in that sense. I really do believe that.
But I do think that's the point is that in black history, when it was taught in the historically black colleges and in the black communities, we kind of saw it differently.
Oh, I'm sure you did.
And that the what's it called, the lost cause thing, I think contributed to the opposite.
The lost cause point of view is the one that became sort of, and it became the reigning view in American history until the civil rights movement. And then, in the 50s and 60s, people started reconsidering that. But it's amazing to me how powerful that lost cause movement was, even to the point of affecting John Kennedy.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, that's amazing when you think about it.
Well, maybe not.
Well, maybe not. It's sort of amazing then. Okay. Was there oh, yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi. First, I want to thank you. I look forward to reading
your
thank
book.
You. My connection to Andrew Jackson is a little
Johnson.
Is a little personal in that.
Oh, yeah?
I'm a descendant of one of the founders of the Freedmen's Bureau.
Oh, no kidding.
So my family, the oral history, he was like the most hated person in my family. But one of the things that was handed down that we always knew was how hard it was to get him out of office. The many times that I don't think that there's ever been a president that was ever as investigated as many times, and the attempts to impeach him.
No, I think you're absolutely right. But
so
you know what?
Well,
go ahead. Go ahead.
That, even to the point where they tried to say that he was complicit in the assassination.
That's right. Early on, they were trying to say that. Yeah.
So, with the charges being that serious, he eventually is impeached for seemingly something very relatively insignificant in comparison to all the things that he had been charged with.
Yeah, but it's you have some great points, and it's really interesting. And later I want to hear who your relative was. But in any event, the interesting thing is some of those charges, like part of the conspiracy to kill Lincoln and all of that, there was no proof of that. And it was almost as if those were kind of like red herrings. It's like, we're so desperate to get this out, we'll make anything up. And they look bad doing that in that particular sense. The interesting thing is that it comes down, except in your history, it comes down that the Tenure of Office Act was sort of this silly thing that they got him on, basically. Somebody once said to me, didn't they ensnare him on that? And I said, no, it wasn't a silly thing, because when we put it back in the context, it was there to protect Stanton, who was there to protect the military, who was there to protect the men and women of the South, particularly the black men and women, but also the white loyalists and that. So it wasn't petty. But the interesting thing then is that the reason that finally Congress or the House got up in arms about it was because that it was easy to see that as a illegal infraction. You know what I'm saying? In other words, he violated the law. And when you just say, well, maybe he did this, or maybe he did that, or maybe he was part of the conspiracy, or maybe he abused power. Of course he abused power. Of course he did of course he obstructed justice, but it was too broad. And a broad notion of impeachment wasn't going to fly. It's still hard to get that to fly now. People, it's much easier to say, oh, he actually broke this law. He thumbed his nose at Congress. We just passed this law, and he's not respecting the law. Screw you, you're out, basically. And that was so it wasn't mistaken in that particular way. But you're right, they'd been trying for a while. But it was as if they were going down these rabbit holes. But they did want to get him out. What was hard, you're right, it was hard. But one other thing, I'm sorry, I'm going on. But one other thing is, it was only one vote. It was only that creep Ross. I hope none of his relatives are here. They went back to no. He wound up in where did he run? New Mexico. He kept getting favors and this and that. But in any event, but it was only one vote. It really was close. And if it hadn't been for Wade, and if it hadn't been for money, one vote. I mean, it's a heart stopper, but that was close. That really, and it was basically, I think he was done by then, because as I said, nobody was going to touch Andrew Johnson. So, but yeah, no, we'll talk. Thank you. I guess you're the Mr. Last.
Hi, Brenda. How do you explain that over 150 years after the impeachment, Johnson basically has a free ride, or got a free ride, and criticism of the impeachment, and, as you pointed out, Kennedy complimenting as courageous the person who voted against the impeachment. What was it about the American culture which said this is a good guy? He's been unfairly treated.
Well, I think that the young person who spoke over here, I'm all for that, spoke over here, put her finger on the lost cause. The fact that, in a sense, that the way that, to my mind, the way the sort of country sort of moved, in a sense, toward placating, really, the South in many ways, especially after 1877, after Reconstruction is really over, and began rewriting American history from the vantage point of that lost cause, is a reason why this story has been lost, because in that particular telling, the racial politics and the importance of the racial politics was either omitted entirely or downplayed or handled in a racist manner. There's no other way to say it, really, in that particular way, So it's one of those three things, and I think that they all work together, and I think that's why. And that's why I think in the sort of in the 60s, particularly, because Profiles and Courages in 57, but things start to slowly change. But as was pointed out, I think Du Bois's book on Reconstruction might have been in 1935, but didn't have the same kind of power as A Birth of a Nation does, And I even have, as I said earlier, but I won't get into it because I know you either have other questions or want to have dinner or something. And is that, even redoing that movie as Lincoln, I still have some problems with that in that particular way, the way that's handled. So, but I think that's why. Is that it? I think we're out of time. You're done. I'm done. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.